video response to the video by Anonymous called A Message to Future Generations. Now, go back and watch this first if you will. It's just, what I have to say is that they are on point. They're definitely onto something. Now, I have to touch on my past to get into how I have came to these conclusions, or at least realizations, because there's always more to know. It's that, I was born in 1993, and then as I became 7, 10, those sort of ages, I was one of the first, we were the first people on Earth to really start getting computers in households. We had the box computers with dial-up internet, and that was the start of what is becoming known as the mass awakening, because although history repeats itself in many ways, like, this is the only point in time we've come this far. We've been able to connect this much, and we've been able to find information this fast. So we've only just got here. 15 years later where we are now, about 15 years later where we are now, look, it's advanced rapidly. We have broadband, high-speed internet, we have smartphones, and it's just really took off. And the ability for people to produce their own music and to push their own stuff out there, their own creations, and express themselves, it's massive. And the youth are not ignorant of this. So when people say to you, pessimistic people say, oh, the youth of today are just glued to their smartphones and this and that, it's that in a sense, but no, it's so much more than that, because the technology, and Anonymous touched on this in their video, it can be used for negative purposes if you're just glued to a screen, and for example, if you're just looking up celebrity gossip. But there's a lot more to it than that, because you can also find information that wasn't accessible to the general public before. You would have to be like a university student or have access to a very nice library to find some of the medicinal properties of cannabis, to find out the truth about them. But now you've just got to type it in on Google. So obviously the information processing is speeding up rapidly, and the youth are able to compare these computers, this technological system, to the human body, how we are essentially biological computers, and the software which you choose to run is your choice, but also somewhat not your choice, because there are people pushing their agenda on us. And this is where it comes to, what is this conspiracy? What is the mass awakening from? The mass awakening is from suppression of who we really are. And the conspiracy is the Illuminati. Now, obviously, some people touch on this and it's just, they think, oh, it's some celebrities that are in the Illuminati, and they laugh about it. But it's a lot deeper than that. It comes into the banking system and all of this. But, right. So my story, I remember being about 13 years old, and me and this one girl in particular, we would always talk on very deep conversations. Just for instance, once walking across the bridge in our city, and we're like, oh my god, do we really just want to go through school and then work and pay taxes just to buy things that we don't need? This is bullshit. And we were onto something, and we had dreams of, traveling to New York and exploring the planet, and it was not in our capabilities at that time. But the point is that this was part of an impulse to do something different. Fast forward a little bit, I became involved in what was essentially like a gang, and it was just typical teenage boys, and we're thinking it's good to fight and we want to have a good reputation for doing reckless things and stealing and things like that. But at the end of the day, we were just out for a good time, really, and we did find like support in each other in like quite a cold world, although we weren't always nice to each other. But then when I got a little bit older, 16, 17, I started ducking out of like big crowds and would only associate with a fair few people. And for instance, one group of friends I had, it was me and a couple of others, we would talk about aliens. We would listen to conscious UK rap music, and then because it was talking about what we think about, question things like religion and gods, and the Christian religion in particular, and how it manipulates people and tricks people. And we got into 2012 a lot. At this point, it was when it was just it was spoken of quite often, 2012, end of the world, and that's about as far as you really get with it. But we were really into it. Like, I don't think we actually thought the world would end, but we did think there was something to it, and only now do I understand what that was. But at the time, it was just like, oh, okay, maybe the world's gonna end, and we'd look on some conspiracy websites when we get home, and we're talking on MSN, which was the messenger that day, and then eventually, like, me and one person, we'd stay up very late. He was conscious and rapped, and then it's like he showed me a documentary called called Home, and it was about the earth and about how we're exploiting the earth, and we've got all of these resources available, but we're just, for example, we're giving plants grains to cows to make meat, but really you could grow a lot more nutritious grains to feed people directly, and how we're draining the water and all of these things. So we ourselves were coming up as conscious youth. That was the awakening, but we didn't know it at that time. Then you have to fast forward a little bit more. A couple of years later, I somewhat isolated myself because I was fed up of the way I was living. Like, I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I wasn't earning any money. I was just doing the same things every weekend and living for the weekend, and it wasn't that good. So I started to read more about the civil rights movement and reading books by the Dalai Lama and things like this, and just really connecting. And then I did have a Twitter account that was personal, but at one point what I'd done is I made a weed Twitter account because I found my tweets about weed were getting a lot of retweets, so it was called Weed is the Answer. And then eventually I had like 7,500 followers at its peak, and these were people from across the world, from America and in the UK, but also other countries like Canada, just across the world, who were also, obviously, if they were attracted to my tweets, were either weed smokers or just other conscious people into meditation and things like that. Now, towards the end of this, I came into contact with an account, and he won't mind me mentioning this, I'm sure, and his account is gone, but it was called Syrian Urigan. Eventually he changed his name to Shiva Lingam and left the whole mass following behind, but he had over approaching, I think, 20,000 followers, and I done some calculations from the amount of retweets he was getting, which were hundreds at times, and I realized this guy is on his way to like 100,000 and potentially 1 million followers if he keeps going. And so his followers were a lot of people. Eventually, bear in mind, I found out he was only 16, but I thought he was maybe like my age. I was 19, 20, but he wasn't, and he had adults following him and like really almost worshipping him as some kind of guru. He was very articulate, and the way he writ his message, it was like he was able to piece things together like a genius, like an actual genius. Now, he was living in Syria, but he was so conscious, not that other Syrians aren't, but like he was something else. And so at the time, it was when we were just being told about the Syrian, like the supposed uprising and about, the fighting in Syria. And he realized that Daesh or ISIS, they were actually funded and trained by governments in America and things like this to destabilize the Middle East. And other things this person would talk about were things about how we're beings of frequency and how Wi-Fi and radiation, things like that, are actually messing with us. The mobile phone towers, the text messages that are being sent, and how chemtrails are being sprayed, and how these are things which are affecting the weather, and as is HAARP, if you look into that in America, and how the chemicals which they spray affect things on the ground, the people, the animals. And this is something which isn't admitted by official sources, and if any one person just came to these conclusions themselves, they would just doubt themselves very quickly. But because we had these connections and people across the world each piecing together parts of the puzzle, we started to really recognize that something is going on in the world, or at least that's what was happening to me. And another person, because like bear in mind, like I had a lot of followers, WWE female wrestlers and things really like this, but it was because we're talking about the youth, there was another conscious youth, and he would talk about zoos. Like, why do we put animals in zoos and then go and photograph them when they're basically in prison? And circuses, how we mistreat animals, and also the oceans, the whales, and how the dolphins are being slaughtered, and things like this. It all started to piece together, because also like looking at the whales, like the reason a lot of them get beached is because of the sonar, the radar from submarines, and that all connects back to like the warships. But we were just very conscious people. Now, Syrian Urigan, he was actually planning on moving away out of his country and bringing some people with him to start a community in Costa Rica. Now, at the time, I doubted this, because the stuff he was saying was mind-blowing. I thought maybe he's just trying to mislead people, and I wasn't really clued up enough. And he asked me to go, and I changed my mind back and forth 2 times because I wasn't sure if it was the right thing. And now I feel like I was supposed to stay here, but I think if we were to do that, like knowing what we know now, it would be very possible. And it wasn't just that he wanted to start a cult. A cult is essentially like a mini replica of the system we're trying to escape. A cult is like a small religion. It has like one or a couple of leaders who have the knowledge which they're not telling to the rest of the people, and the people follow them. Like a lot of cults dress the same and things like this. That's not what these people were about. They were about just putting together our different experiences and letting people be themselves as individuals, but also working together to actually stop the system which is crushing people. So that's where we're at. And then you've got to think about the fact of like the other youth in the world, the ones who aren't able to reach us through technology because they're living in such severe poverty. They're living in shanty towns where next to them there's very wealthy people living in big buildings. And you've got to think about the people who are being killed bombed in wars, like having their limbs blown off, and they're being burnt by napalm. And these are our governments dropping those things where supposedly we're free people, but we're actually compliant in killing people and causing people to starve. And we didn't want to be part of that. We don't want to be part of that. That's what the youth are saying. Now this was all a few years ago, so now it's moved rapidly. Like it's moving even faster. It's moving even faster. And not all of them, like some are on different levels of the waking up to others, but the youth in general like are not really trying to stand for it. That's what the message is. When the youth see someone who is conscious and who is older than them, then they will try to get through to them. And what you have to do, my message to the future generations and the present generations, is that you've got to kind of try to understand and support each other. You're not always going to get along, and there is a lot to deal with. There's a lot of pressure of being young, pressure to conform, and anxiety about, do you look right, do you have the latest smartphones and things like this. And it does kind of, like, it's hard, and you're not always going to get along, but we're all in this together, no matter what your peer group, no matter what category of person you come under. And with the older and younger people, whether it's youth and people who are a bit older, or whether it's older people and very old people, like what we have to do is, I mean, the older people have knowledge and experience that they need to pass on to the youth, and the youth have fresh minds and they know things which older people don't know. So what we have to do is kind of come together and be catalysts for change. We have to be catalysts for change. So what is this mass awakening? This mass awakening is that from a very early age we're taught that we need to conform by a lot of different things. Some people it's more that they get drawn into a religion. For some people it's more that they're taught to conform, that they have to act a certain way. It's just, then you start to see that the world isn't exactly as it seems, because we're not going to be able to live like very wealthy lifestyles, all of the people on earth. There's too many of us to do that. Eventually we are going to drain the earth of its resources, and what will happen is that a few people have a lot while some have hardly anything, and we're almost living in that now. There are people at the top who are living very, very wealthy lifestyles while the majority of people struggle to get by. Whether you're in a Western society and your parents are working 3 jobs just to pay the bills, and so they're stressed so they don't have time for you, or whether you're someone in a very impoverished country and like a so we called third world country, and you're just like, you just don't have shit. We're all in this together. Whether you're the person who's got the new iPhone, or whether you're the child who's being used as a slave to manufacture the iPhones, we're all in this together. And that's what we're about. Like, it's to realize that we are one consciousness expressing itself in different ways. And if someone else is being hurt, if someone else is in pain, if we're getting good things, or so we see them as good things, for the expense of other people, at the expense of other people, then it's not going to be something that where we want to live. Because what's, to round this up, so you have the people in our Western society who are, you know, being taught, the young people, they're being taught you have to conform, and like you become very anxious about yourself, and you're not willing to express yourself and who you truly are and pursue the hobbies which you really want to pursue. And then you have the people who can't do anything because they are being bombed, because they are starving. And I mean, you have the youth in our countries who are being accepted more and more because, you know, they're in the community that we call LGBT or whatever, but then there are other youth in other countries who will be killed if they admit this. So we're all kind of trying to work towards a time where that we're accepting each other, and where we're working towards a common good. And what that common good is, it's not conforming, it's not being politically correct, it's not fitting in with everyone else. It's about working with everyone else regardless of how or who they are, so that we can live in a world where people can be happy and so where people can thrive. And the manipulation is what we're starting to wake up from, and the more you wake up, the more they will try to stop you connecting, the more they will try to portray you as a bad person. But deep down, like, we all know what's just and unjust, and our lives do begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And I'll leave this video on a quote by Martin Luther King, which on many occasions has made me burst into tears, and it's something like this: you may be 38 years old as I happen to be, and one day some great cause calls you to stand up for justice. Some great principle, some great ishar, and I don't even know what that last word is, sorry, but some great principle, and you refuse to do it. You refuse to do it because you're scared. You're scared that somebody will stab you or shoot at you or bomb your house. You're scared that you will lose your job. You're scared that you will lose your popularity. So you refuse to do it. And you're just dead. You're just as dead at 38 as you would be, and I forgot what he says, but basically, when you do eventually die at age 90 or whatever, your death, physical death, is something of a belated announcement of an earlier death. You died in spirit when you refused to stand up for truth. You died in spirit when you refused to stand up for justice. You died. And the youth don't want to be living like walking corpses. They don't want to become zombies in a police state. I mean, it's all coming together, you know. We have mass surveillance, so it's up to us how we use the technology. We can use it to our benefit, or we can use it to just take away more freedoms and things like this. And the youth generally don't want to become zombies, but they need guidance from the elders, and the elders need to stop and listen to them, truly listen to them and what they're saying. And maybe we can just work our way out of this trap.